The problem with a power development phase in climbing is that most of the things that we consider to be power exercises in our specific climbing training might not be all that powerful. Power is a very definable and discrete quality in exercise science. Yet with climbing programming, I think we kind of got off on the wrong foot. And one of the things that happened early on was we sort of guessed at what were power-like exercises for climbing, and then used like a classical old school periodization model that was based not really on a high skill sport like climbing, but more on running or weight training, where we had a big discrete power development phase. Now, when we look at the definition of power, it's really strength with a speed component. And there's a really useful and easy to understand graphic called the force velocity curve. And at one end of the force velocity curve, we're at very, very high force and very, very low speed. And that would be like when you're picking up the heaviest weight off the floor that you've ever picked up, and it's really, really slow and you can barely move it. So maximum force, very low velocity. And at the other end, all the way at the far, far end, we would have maximum speed where there's very little resistance. And a thing like throwing a baseball might be all the way out at that end, where there is really not a lot of power or strength involved, but a high level of speed. And the sweet spot for developing power is probably at about 30 to 50% of your maximum strength. But we can develop power in a little bit broader range, which is about 20 to 90% of your maximum strength. But the important part there is to use explosive type movements. There's a way that we like to look at this, and we call this the strength continuum. At the very, very high end, like at the high end of the force velocity curve, we have high stability movements that we can use high force with. And imagine yourself doing a bench press or a weighted pull-up. The implement is very stable. It's very easy to stay connected to. A big pull-up bar is easy to hold on to. And I can generate a ton of force against it. Now, if I switch to doing pull-ups on a hangboard where I'm hanging just off the small edge, it's not quite as stable. It's not as quite easy to hold on to as a pull-up bar. And so it's getting less stable, and therefore I can put less force into it. There's just nobody that can do as heavy a pull on a 10 millimeter edge as they can on a pull-up bar. So imagine we go one step further and we use a couple of tension blocks and we do pull-ups on those. Those are even less stable. And so then we can generate even less force against those. And so as we move away from stability, we also have to use less and less force. And this is one of the big errors that people get into when they switch to purely body weight training or just going climbing, is you can't generate the same necessary forces to develop high levels of strength as you can in a stable environment. With power exercises, we want to continue to develop power in exercises where we're already stable. And so we'll use the pull-up, for example, here. I can do a pull-up regular pace and do it with a lot of load. If I want to speed it up, use a little bit more power, I have to drop the load just a little bit. And I like going into that 20 to 90% range to where I can go just a little bit faster on that pull, and I can do my repetition in less time, and that starts to develop more and more power. Now, if we went really, really light, went all the way down, we were doing a 10-pound lat pull down, we would be developing almost no power, and that's easy for us to see. But there is a sweet spot somewhere below our max strength where we can develop this explosiveness. The problem is, like I said, when we're in our climbing mode, doing climbing specific exercises, those aren't necessarily power exercises. Let's take the campus board, for example. For most people, when they're campusing, the movement upward is actually somewhat slow because we're not all that strong when we're pulling up. And then I move really quickly to the next rung. And so there is a power or speed component to moving my unloaded arm, but the loaded portion of the movement is probably too slow to develop actual power. And so if I want to use the campus board to develop power, I need to make sure that I'm going at a higher speed than I normally could, and I'm unloading it in a way that I can continue to go quickly and have successful reps. You might use a kickboard for this. Other exercises that you can use would be jump squats, explosive power push-ups, medicine ball work, all of these things that have a dynamic component to it. And a really good way to tell if an exercise is truly a power exercise is that you can't do it slowly. Trying to do a push-up where your hands come up off the floor is very, very hard to do at a slow cadence. Jumping onto a 30-inch box is really hard to do unless you generate some speed and some explosiveness there. And so those are going to be the things that are key in starting to develop your power. Now, those are very general exercises. Box jumps and power push-ups and explosive pull-ups are not the same as climbing, and I understand that. But we need to develop a basis for power, and then we can move into more sport-specific movements. When we're trying to develop power, one of the first things we'll think about is, oh, I'm going to boulder because bouldering is powerful. But remembering that power is optimally developed probably under 10 seconds of effort. When we're doing a boulder problem, very often, almost all the time, the boulders take longer than that. And so if I'm truly going to develop power with bouldering, I need to shorten up those sets, do shorter problems, 3 or 4 moves maybe, instead of doing a full moonboard problem. And then as I develop explosiveness and power in those movements, I can go to smaller and smaller holds, bigger and bigger moves, and develop my ability there, and then go on to full boulder problems and apply it in a performance way. Now, when we are starting to do power training, we start with high speed, explosive movements, box jumps, medicine ball tosses, power pull-ups. There's a ton of explosive exercises you can do in a weight room or a gym, and that's where we want to start. And then we start going into some more sport-specific durations and intensities. Now, again, we can't just go and start jumping our way out the cave or campusing out a boulder, but what we want to do is go to explosive movements that are duration specific, 8, 10, 12 seconds. And then finally, the final step is to start applying that to our climbing. And it's very hard to go to a limit problem and have the mindset of, oh, I'm going to climb a lot more powerfully now. Because when we are at our limit, we're just climbing. We're really trying to perform as well as possible. And so what we want to do is at the beginning of a session, after we're warmed up and we're moving pretty well, we can intentionally go in and do some explosive movement, but on boulders that are substantially lower than our limit and probably just barely above your warm-up grade. You can do some explosive movement, do some more jumpiness, some tension-oriented explosions, and then you can go back to just normal bouldering, and over time, your explosive practice will start to bleed into your skill set that you use at your limit. Now, as far as programming goes, it's not wise to have an entire phase that you're just developing power. If you're focusing on just powerful movement for an entire 4 or 6 or 8 week phase, you tend to let things like maximum strength and capacity drop off. And so I am a huge fan of marrying strength and power exercises into the same training phases. It's really hard to separate them out in practice. Like, is hard bouldering always power? Is it always strength? Is weight training powerful or is it strength oriented? It's really hard to tell. And so let's not worry about that distinction, and instead remember that high intensity, short duration sets are the way that we're going to get powerful and strong, and it's okay to do both of those things at the same time. So a lot of people wonder when they're ready to train power. When am I ready to do explosive versions of movements? Well, I think the time that you're ready to do explosive versions of movements is when you can do the slow version. Can I do a regular pace pull-up? Great, looks good, technically correct. Let's move on to an explosive version of it. We want to do the explosive versions at that 30 to 50% level. And once we're doing those explosive versions at 30 to 50% for a while, then we can increase the intensity, or we can actually do more sets of those things. So we're increasing the volume of those things. Both of those are valid ways to increase our power. Now, when we're looking at general power exercises, we want to think of things that are relatively stable that we can do without risk of injury. Jumping squats are great. Jumping onto a box is great. Walking lunges, sprints, all of those are powerful exercises that we can do with the lower body. We don't do a lot of core specific power because that tends to radiate into the low back. And most people, when they're moving quickly with their low back, don't have a lot of discipline. And so let's go on up to upper body. We can do medicine ball work like chest passes, rotational throws. We can do explosive versions of the bench press, of the push-up. We can do things where we're doing campus moves like from a kick rail or explosive pull-ups. All of those are valid general power upper body exercises. As we get more specific, we can go to smaller holds on the campus board. We can do foot off stuff if we can keep that speed up, and it's still in that zone of 20 to 90% of our maximum ability. And so we want to keep thinking in terms of, am I doing it well? Am I doing it quickly? And am I doing it at a percentage of my maximum ability? When I get on the hardest boulder move I can possibly do, I probably shouldn't be thinking of how fast can I do this move.